Hey everybody, it's Matt Nelson here again. This is the Evangelization and Culture Show, and I'm with Jared Zimmer as always. How's it going?
Good, man. Yeah, got a good interview coming up today. We,
Yeah.
of course, had Mrs. Haley Stewart. And we've been fans of her for quite some time, and kind of like through social media, getting to know her. But my first time actually that I came upon some of her work was actually the way she was explaining literature, particularly in regard to how to use it in the family. And so it was really awesome getting to just sit down with her today to talk about books, basically, something that comes up a lot in this show.
The conversation was full of book recommendations, which people are going to love. But I also like how there's a little bit of theoretical conversation, but also like Haley was really good at applying the love of literature and the desire to incorporate literature into your life and into the life of your family through telling real life stories. Really, she talked a little bit about some of the journeys her family's been on over the last few years and how literature even played a role through those experiences. So really great interview today. And
and something that I think is important as well is when we think about literature, something that Bishop Barron says all the time, and we actually go into this in the interview, is that kind of balance between new media and old media. Bishop Barron always says that if you're going to have something to say in new media, you really need to understand the old media very, very well. And some of these stories that we find in literature are just fantastic ways to be able to touch modern culture in a way that kind of leads with beauty. So, so it's a great interview, and let's go right into it.
All right, so we're here with Haley Stewart, who is an expert in many different things. She's a mom, she's a wife, she's an author, she's a very popular podcaster, and she's got lots to teach us. And so today we're going to talk to her about literature in the home. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. Well, let's just jump right into this. So let's start with talking about what we mean by literature. So we know you're a fan of reading to your children, you yourself are an avid reader, and that you advocate for the good books, if not the great books, and that those should be read even to young children. And so let's just start by talking about what literature is, and then we'll maybe launch into a conversation about what would make a good or a great book.
Sure. Well, I think that literature, obviously there's going to be different definitions coming from different people, but I think of literature as something that is both high art, the quality of the craftsmanship of the work, and is something that points us towards the transcendentals, the true, the good, and the beautiful. And so those things together make truly good literature. I think there are books out there that we would say, well, that is good literature as far as it's very high quality crafted art, but maybe we would say, but it doesn't point us towards the true, the good, and the beautiful. So I think kind of those two working together.
Yeah. What about like the word classic? So like we talk about the classics, and we could actually probably have a conversation about the classics of children's literature, but then also like the classics that someone like John Senior, like Anthony Esselin today would be talking about, or any advocate of classical literature. But how do you picture like the word classic when we're talking about literature? What makes a classic?
I think a classic is a story that speaks to the human experience in a way that it is timeless. And so no matter what era the child that picks it up is living in, it's going to speak to them. And so whether that's Beatrix Potter, that, this is beautiful and it's whimsical, and I want to read about talking animals, whether I'm living in 2019 or 1960 or 1900. And so I think that sense of timelessness is kind of what makes something a classic work. Just how for grown-ups, we're still going to read Plato, and it's still going to be meaningful to us now.
Yeah. What is it about, one thing, I guess one question also is, have you always been a reader? Has it always been?
I came from a very introverted family. I'm the most extroverted of my family, so I didn't realize I was an introvert until college, because in comparison, I was so extroverted. So there was just a lot of downtime and a lot of reading time. Everybody liked to read. And because everybody needed their quiet time, I would find myself always reaching for books. And so I got really into reading from a young age. And then I feel like kind of rediscovered that in college a little bit. I think just busyness of middle school and high school and extracurriculars and all these things, that got rekindled for me in college. And then especially after I had my first child, getting to kind of share those books with him.
Was it always stories, or was it getting into more like nonfiction?
I am definitely a story-driven reader. I have to force myself to read nonfiction, and so I try to pick out a few good ones every year to be like, okay, these are my nonfiction reads, but I'm always going to reach for the story first.
Yeah, stories were the first thing that got me to become a reader. Of course, mine was Tolkien, as many people have that experience with Tolkien. But what do you think it is about human nature that sort of desires these stories? Because we've been doing this now for thousands of years, telling each other stories, and talking about classics. It's the great storytellers that are really the ones that last for a long time. And so what is it about human nature that kind of desires, some people might say it's escapism, that we're trying to escape reality. Other people might say there's maybe something deeper there.
I think that God wired us for story, both to learn through story. Like Jesus explains things to the disciples through the parables. He knows that human beings are wired to understand ideas and difficult ideas through stories, not just explaining it in a linear way, but through a narrative. And so I think God designed us that way. And then I think that those stories kind of carry us through so much of the human experience, both prepare us for things that might happen to us, or help us see them in a different light, or see ourselves as part of a bigger story. We're in the story of our life, but then we're within the story of God's love for creation in a much bigger story. And so I think all of those things make them so compelling.
Yeah, and I would say too, just to add to that, is the human experience is an embodied experience. And so, the scholastic philosophical maxim, there's nothing in the intellect that's not first in the senses, kind of speaks to that. In order to utilize the imagination, which is a distinctly human characteristic, to be able to do that, we need to experience things in the world we live in, which is it's the world of the senses, and so C.S. Lewis made the differentiation between reason being the organ of truth and the imagination being the organ of meaning. And so I feel like stories really give us the full package. We've talked about this lots before, Jared, about how stories have the ability to communicate important theological or philosophical truths, the head in the clouds types of truths, but it's almost like there's an incarnational event that's happening through the story of portraying those notional ideas.
It seems like it kind of just like it speaks to the heart. Of course it speaks to the head as well. Of course you read like C.S. Lewis, and I immediately think of the space trilogy and how obviously he creates this beautiful narrative, but in it he's also kind of hidden these truths that kind of get to the head. So it seems like one of the principles that we operate on is leading with beauty. And so literature is one of those things that von Balthasar called it an arresting quality, that in the narrative of a good story, you're able to kind of release some of these maybe preconceived notions that you bring to the story. And so it releases some of that and allows you to take in something new. And so what is it about, thinking about, of course, this whole show is about evangelization, and so you've grown quite a big platform talking a lot about, of course, books, being a mother, being a wife, et cetera. But books in particular, what do you think it is that, because it seems like, the numbers continue to show that people are reading less and less. However, there's numbers showing that it's actually interest in books is increasing, but maybe not the actual reading habits. So what is it that people are kind of drawn to? Of course, we're talking about stories here, but also just like a bookishness. Is there like that kind of like cultural reality of having lots of books and kind of even in the home, right? Of just the whole the pillars of your home are held up by the books type of thing.
I think that people want to share stories, like have this comment of the story and I know the story, and so we can make a reference to this character and you know what I mean, and it's this camaraderie. And I think that in the past, everyone knew the Bible backwards to forwards. You would have known the Old Testament figures, and you could have talked about, in the South, in the American South, we have all kinds of little idioms and things that reference the Old Testament. And I think that as people have lost that, there hasn't been any common cultural language for them to communicate. And so I think that is a desire. And I think within the home, that can be a really beautiful thing. That, we've all read The Lord of the Rings together. And we can we can make references to that. And we all know this story and it's special to us. So when we reread this, we're going to, I can't wait for this part. And this is your favorite part. I think there's something that is very, very beautiful and brings people together. And just backing up a little bit to what we were saying about why do people reach out for stories, I think that also people find hope in stories. I've been thinking a lot with the new Little Women film adaptation that's coming out. I've been thinking about that book and what it's meant to me and what it meant to my mom. And thinking about that, I realized it was really important in our house because she read it as a little girl and she was living in a very tumultuous home where there was addiction and mental illness. And so to read about Marmee and the 4 March sisters and this happy home that was peaceful and safe gave her this hopefulness that could be her home someday. And that's really what she created for my brother and I. And so like thinking about all that, I realized how crucial that story was for her young imagination to see beyond her circumstances towards something that could be like I can be Marmee.
Yeah. Do you think as a parent, I mean, thinking about just getting children involved in literature and stuff, it's also a way to deal. I mean, as you said, like dealing with things like reality, which is some families have addiction, mental illness, or some have abandonment. These are the things, or some, and we've kind of like closed ourselves off from a lot of this stuff, and we don't talk about it as a family. But stories allow us to kind of deal with these things in what I guess you would call it like a somewhat disengaged way. So like whenever, I know one of the pieces or one of my favorite things you've written was on Harry Potter and how they deal with death. And so sometimes as parents, it's really hard to talk to kids, especially young kids, about what death is. But that allows for kind of, maybe disengage isn't the right word, but kind of. It's like we're both experiencing this thing together.
Yeah, and it's safe to delve into these ideas because it is still a book.
Yes.
But I'm connected to this story and it's giving me a framework to talk about these things or understand these things. And I think death is such a like taboo topic to talk about with children. Like it's very common to not take kids to funerals. Because that's death and that's morbid and we don't want them to have to think about that. But they do need to think about that, not in a terrifying, traumatizing way, but that this is part of life and grief and loss are part of life. And so experiencing that in books, I think really does prepare children to just give them a schema for how to really understand really difficult topics that maybe they haven't experienced yet within their life, but they're going to, and have that time to prepare and offer an opportunity to have a conversation with that child as you're reading that book.
Well, in the home, it's such an important thing, I think, to create a home culture. We talk about the broader culture and talking the same language because we're reading the same books, maybe worshiping the same God, and all of that informs how we interact with each other as neighbors. But in the home too, you're talking about Little Women. It's one of Amanda's favorite books, and it's a film that she watches every year at Christmas. And so when I first started dating her, I took on the task of reading Little Women, which is a long book, and I'm like the opposite of you guys. I have a real hard time with fiction, but the nonfiction comes a little bit easier. But I read the book, and from what I remember, there's a real love between the sisters of Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, and that kind of, in a way, forms a bond between them. And I'm just wondering, Haley, in your home, what are some of the books, whether they're classics or contemporary books or poetry, that have really had an impact on your family collectively, that inform the way you interact with each other, the stories you tell, or the language you use?
Sure. I think that we end up gravitating towards series. So books like Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little House series are ones we've all read together. We've listened to the audiobooks in the car. We've gone on family trips to visit their homestead in South Dakota and her home
Really?
in
That's awesome.
Missouri. Yeah, it was really cool. We saw Pa's fiddle.
Really? That's awesome.
It was very, very neat. And so experiencing that as a family, and so knowing these characters, but then understanding a little bit more about American history from that time, and okay, it's written in this way. Here's what maybe was actually happening that even the author didn't have a perspective on at that time, or writing as a child, she perceived it this way. Here's what was going on in American history, and just having all those conversations together. I think that's been huge. Lord of the Rings is really big. I think that The Silmarillion was the first book my husband started reading to our newborn son, our firstborn. So he'd be up with him at night, and he was like, well, we're just going to start with The Silmarillion.
Yeah, they're ahead of the game.
Yeah.
There.
That's awesome.
Iluvatar, here we
Yeah,
go.
right, exactly.
And so those have been really important to us. My son has read all the Harry Potter books, but we're just slowly going through one a year.
Sure.
As a family, because we've got littler ones that aren't ready for the later ones. I think those are some big ones. Anne of Gables, that series. I read it aloud to my girls, and my son usually says he doesn't want to listen, but then kind of pokes his head out and comes a few steps in, and then plops down behind the couch where we're reading and listens, and we'll hear him laugh. And so I think just sharing those together, just enjoying them yourself makes your children interested.
For sure.
I'm sure there's ages where maybe that would do the opposite. If mom and dad like this, I'm not interested. But
Yeah, right.
I think with young children especially, they're excited if you're excited.
And throughout, one thing that I've come to find with my kids is that the more you teach them through good story, or a big thing in our house is actually poetry. They really like poems. Is that it goes all the way back to Plato and Aristotle, talking about this kind of ability to grow in not just the virtues, but also things like empathy, things like courage, because you're hearing these stories. And in fact, just the other day we did an interview, and they were talking about Cardinal Newman, talking about when you read about someone else's deeds, it inflames the desire within you to do courageous deeds like that individual. And so when I have my kids read, for example, your son coming out and hearing more of a more feminine book, it actually gives him more of an empathy towards maybe the female psyche and the behavior and things like that. And so I think it's just a healthy thing for kids to. It's kind of the old adage of when you read literature, you've lived 1,000 lives because you've lived through these things. So
I think that's also what makes stories about the saints so important for children and for all of us, is to read these true stories, but are compelling narratives that really do, fire us up to want to do courageous deeds. You can't listen to a story about St. Maximilian Kolbe and not think I want to be braver. I want to be more sacrificing.
Yes.
To be, what would it be like to be that person?
Yeah.
I think stories are just so crucial for all of our imaginations, but particularly forming a child's imagination.
Yeah.
The lives of the saints are interesting because you almost kind of get, in a way, a little taste of different genres of literature depending on what saint you're reading about. With some of the miracles and some of the the penances that they did, and some of the
Battling Satan. And
yeah.
Some horror in there. Yeah.
Some of the some of the great acts of love and different heroic deeds that they did. Sometimes you feel like you're reading fantasy, or and obviously a skeptic would say you are reading fantasy, but we won't get into that right now. But of course, we're not reading fantasy. These stories really happen. They're about real people. Which saints or which lives of the saints have you found your kids have really been intrigued by?
I think that my girls are always very drawn to saints who want to give up everything and serve the poor. So Saint Elizabeth of Hungary, they're very into her. And I think my son is more drawn to, now I can't remember his name, Mexican martyr. It was just his
Miguel
feast.
Pro?
Miguel Pro,
Yeah,
yes.
he's one of my all-time favorites.
Blessed Miguel Pro. The saints who were maybe a little bit closer to contemporary times who were doing something very brave.
Yeah.
So
Jared likes to come to the office in disguise from time to time because he's such a Miguel
Pro, exactly.
Yeah. Sorry, I cut you off.
I think he also likes sneaky saints. So
Exactly.
Blessed Jose Sanchez Del Rio is really into him. And so I think I love the saints because everyone can find someone that they either connect with or want to aspire to be. There are so many different kinds of saints. And it is fun to kind of see your kids discovering or being found by different saints.
Yeah, and when it comes to raising kids too, especially in the modern culture, where a lot of what it means to be a male, what it means to be a female, is so skewed and oftentimes just placed in these stereotypes that are kind of on the far ends of what it actually means. The stories of the saints, as well as stories in literature, it allows you opportunities to kind of see the full spectrum of what it actually means to be a man, what it actually means to be a woman. So in the saints, you have like Therese of Lisieux. At the same time, you have Joan of Arc, or thinking of a modern book, you have Hermione Granger, who has this kind of soft moment, but she's also very strong and she's willing to take a stand and fight for what's hers. Same thing with guys, that you can certainly empathize with moments where they need to be soft and caring, but then other moments where they need to pick up the sword and go. I think that's just vitally important in today's kind of modern culture.
Yes, I think Saint Joseph in particular is a really helpful saint to introduce to children as a picture of masculinity, because he's not macho, he's not an alpha male. He's very gentle and he's happy to be in the background and he's quietly serving. And there's such a beautiful strength. I feel like when I'm asking for his intercession, I feel so cared for and protected, but it's all within this gentleness. Yeah. And I think that that's really needed. Yeah. So I totally agree that offering these different images of what the Christian life lived fully alive looks like. Yeah. Really
with St. Joseph, children. He had calloused hands and he was still working with his hands. So you have both sides there, the lion and the lamb.
Yeah, and there's a mystique about St. Joseph too, because we just know so little about him. Yeah. But there's certain things we can infer about him that just have to be true, and about his commitment and his strength and his leadership. It's interesting because in this culture, you listen to other like secular podcasts and there's a real fascination with people who lived heroic lives in different ways, and they're often military figures or great writers or even like what the culture would call like a philanthropist, people who did great loving deeds for others, but there's always sort of like the religious side of things kind of left out, or you just don't hear the culture talking a lot about the saints. And not everything the saints did was religiously loaded. It was all motivated by their love for God and their identity as a Christian. But there was so much more going on that should be fascinating to any human being. And you kind of see this come out in like, are you familiar with Gretchen Rubin?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, we've got a couple of her books on our shelf at home, and as far as I know, I don't think she's a Christian. I don't even know if she's a religious person, but she's certainly got a spiritual bent to some of the things that she writes about. And I'm pretty sure it was her that was like really influenced by Saint Therese of Lisieux and Saint Teresa of Avila, which is interesting because those are two very religious writers. They were religious sisters. But I wonder what the culture could gain from knowing more about the saints and their lives.
Yeah, I think that we're one of the leading examples of evangelization. A lot of times, like when I used to work at a parish, you would have guys come in that were ready with their apologetics boxing gloves, and I knew that they could handle their own, in that realm. So I'd bring in stories of the saints and just say, but have you ever heard of Miguel Pro, or have you ever heard of Francis of Assisi, et cetera? Another thing I did want to talk to you about, and we'll continue talking about reading throughout it, but you've also got a really interesting story with some of the decisions that you and your husband have made, of your husband going off and being a farmer and things like that. Maybe you could share a little bit about like that process.
Sure. So I guess about 5 years ago, we had just had, I guess at the time we had a 4-year-old, a 2-year-old, and a 1-year-old. So we were just coming up for air after kind of being drowning in babies. Not a bad
thing,
not a bad problem to have, but we were coming up for air, kind of being like, okay, we can breathe for a second. And my husband was working a job that he did not enjoy, that he had to work tons of hours, and wasn't getting to really spend a lot of time with our family. We had like a dream for what we wanted our family culture to look like, and as we looked around, we're like, man, this is not what we had in mind. Yeah. But we weren't sure how to make a change. But through prayer and discernment over several months, we decided to sell our house and quit our jobs in Florida and get rid of most of our stuff and move to a farm in Texas. So we were in Florida, moved to Texas, and do a year-long internship there doing sustainable agriculture, living in a teeny tiny apartment with no flushing toilets.
Oh, wow.
And just kind of reboot our family life. Spend tons of time together, living the same place Daniel would be working and learning, and just focus on time spent together and building up and figuring out what do we want our family life to look like? Yeah. What do we want to pursue? And it was, kind of crazy, but it was a great experience. So just reconnecting as a family, having this adventure together, and figuring out, okay, what did we love about this? What can we carry on into the rest of our lives?
Wow. What are some of the kind of the main things you guys, I mean, I'm sure along with that there has to be struggles. There has to be times you're like, what are we doing? But then other times you're like, this is the most amazing thing. What are some of the things you learned? I mean, it sounds like what you've kind of talking about, like Wendell Berry and some of these people that kind of get back to the land and get back to what's actually real. What are some of the things that you saw your family grow through as well as kind of go through during those times?
Yeah, I think that we were able to reconnect with lots of pieces of things that make you feel like a human being. Things like, because we got to spend a lot of time together, we got to really focus on things like family meal times and taking our time to prepare a meal together, and then sitting and talking across the dinner table, having friends come and join us, sitting around by the fire afterwards for an hour, and then doing the dishes together. So it took several hours to have a meal.
Wow.
But then you feel like, wow, I really feel like a human being. And not that we do that every night now that we're living in the city, but trying to say, okay, this is something that's important to our family culture. Eating together, cooking together. And now our kids are, my oldest is 10 and second oldest is 8. And they are really into cooking now. Wow. And so my son, a lot of times he'll cook dinner, especially if it's a night where my husband's working. My husband's a whiskey maker, so he's distilling.
He's got a dream job.
He's got a pretty cool job, so he's making whiskey 4 evenings a week. And a lot of times my son just cooks for us.
That's awesome.
Those nights. And so just making that part of this is a way we like to serve each other. This is something special that people do together. I think that was huge. I think also just being somewhere where we spent lots of time outside, realizing I do feel better when I'm outside and not inside all day. There's something that wasn't great about that. And so prioritizing that, even though we don't live on a farm anymore, we do have a big backyard. So going outside, spending time together, going to the park and going on hikes, doing this as a family. And then I think hospitality was probably the other really big thing, because we had our own little apartment on the farm, but there were other interns and volunteers there. Yeah. So you're living in community and really realizing it really brings something to both our family's life by opening up our home, but also what a great way to serve other people and offer a space.
So you took a big breath and went back to reality. Because sometimes the rat race can get to us.
Yeah.
No kidding. Well, okay, so let's bring literature back into this then. So during that time, what are some of the poems or some of the stories that really spoke to you and your family? You can talk about yourself personally, but also, was there anything in particular that was big during that time in your life?
Well, I think that I felt very guilty for moving away from the wonderful grandparents in our lives. Sure. We have great grandparents, and I felt very guilty about that. And so listening to Little House on the Prairie, it was really helpful, because I was they never saw them ever again. They just left and they're American heroes. So it made me feel a little bit better. And we listened to that on our road trip out. But I think also Wendell Berry was probably a big one. I love his essays in The Art of the Commonplace. Those are great. I love Jay Crow. Hannah Coulter is probably my very favorite one. as far as his fiction goes. And so I think books like Hannah Coulter and Jayber Crow, they do feel like you're taking a breath.
Yeah.
Like these people are living lives where they have time to reflect, and they have time to cook a meal, and they have time to go on a walk in the woods. And that shouldn't be weird, but it is.
Right. Yeah.
And so I think that that those were probably pretty key to our crazy adventure.
How do you guys balance? I mean, of course, Word on Fire, we're very much a new media as your platform. So how do you balance? I mean, as a family, it's always difficult to balance how to use media and as well as books. I mean, because you want them to kind of experience the world, but not fully, because there are some dangers involved. But then also just in your own personal life, how do you kind of balance the use of new media as well as being able to kind of reflect and get more into the simple?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's something we definitely struggle with, and I think we're not alone.
Oh, yeah.
I think one thing we do is we usually don't get the next big thing immediately, like whatever the new system is,
Yeah,
or
a new phone or anything.
we usually wait.
Yeah.
And I think that just kind of helps you kind of prepare yourself for what challenges there might be with that new technology, and not feel like you're constantly having to keep up with something. I think also we try to make technology something that we do as a family. Mm-hmm. So we tried, like one of my kids had an iPad, and we were like, this isn't working. Yeah. Like you can't have this. And it was kind of dramatic, but we were just like, this is not what we want our family life to look like. It's not working for you. It's not working for us. But he can play Clash of Clans with Dad in a clan. So like Dad's there in the same clan, keeping an eye on what's going on. So they can play a game, but it's something that's safe, and it's something that they're doing together.
Yeah.
And so like watching a movie together, or playing a game together, rather than everyone's on a device in their own space and everyone's cut off from each other. I think that's something that Pope Francis has talked about a little bit, is how if we're using technology as a way to isolate ourselves, then we need to turn things around. Yeah. And so I think keeping that in mind, how can we use this in a way that's positive for our family culture, that brings us together, like family movie night or something like that, rather than everybody's watching their own thing that they like the best on their screen.
Yeah.
How do you feel about reading stories on a screen?
I hate it.
So do I.
I can't, and it's not like, I know some people love it, or they're traveling a lot, so having like a Kindle with all their books is just really great, and I'm sure it is. I believe
it's them. Like our mutual friend Brandon Vaught, the content director at Word on Fire. That guy can read a book on anything. That's why he reads 1 billion books a year. But I don't know how he does it, because
I can't do it. Like I have to have it in my hand, or I feel like it's work somehow.
Yeah.
Like if it's in my hand and it's a real book, then it feels like a treat. And if it's on a screen, then I don't want to be there.
Yeah. I can sympathize for sure. What about owning books versus taking books out of a library? Is there an argument that could be made for owning at least some books?
I think absolutely. And I mean, I think I'm known as kind of a minimalist because we got rid of most of our stuff before we made this move to this little apartment. And in a lot of ways, we are minimalist, but not with books. Yeah. Having the books I love around is really important to me, both because I can lend them to people. Yeah. Someone comes over, I'm like, you would love The Girl of the Limberlost, and I can just pass it over. And having books around for our children to discover, because sometimes they don't want to read the book that you have asked them to read. Right. They are just wandering around the house, and they found something on the shelf and thought, hey, this looks cool. And so I think that is important. And I know they've done studies about reading and academic success in children, and you would think it would be how many minutes a day that child has been read to or spends reading. But the connection actually seems to be how many books are in their house, which seems odd, but just being surrounded by books makes a difference in a child's desire.
The humanities scholar Harold Bloom, in one of his books, I think it's called What to Read, maybe How and What to Read. He talks about how as a child he wasn't really much of a reader, but there were just books everywhere, and all of the adults at some point he saw them holding a book, and it was kind of one of those things of it's this mystery behind it of like what's in there that I'm missing out on, you know. And it's funny because we're all concerned about what are the kids reading. Let them just pick something up and read. Like at a certain
unless
point,
it's like 50 Shades of Grey.
Right, unless it's that. Yeah. Well, you shouldn't have that in your house anyway.
Yeah, it should be. Yeah, exactly. We don't have it in our house.
If your 6-year-old goes and picks up the Summa, like it's fine. Like they may not understand a word of it, but it's fine. Like let them dive in, you know. Because there's something about kind of getting back into dealing with modern culture and with kids, that there's a reality that they are able to enter into that sometimes, of course, philosophers have been talking about this for thousands of years, but sometimes reality in our own head doesn't seem real, and those books allow us to kind of get into something real. And so Tolkien would talk about how literature, poetry, these things, it's not escapism. That it's actually entering into something more real than what life oftentimes feels like, you know. So whenever talking about your story, this is why I love the connection here, is that sometimes in the rat race, sometimes in just normal life, we get so busy, and it's just reality. I mean, sometimes just to make it as a family, you got to have both spouses working. You got to have these things set up so that you can get dinner done in 20 minutes and all this kind of stuff. But books almost force you to sit down, take a breather, and just focus and relax. And so it does seem like we always talk about real and notional assent here all the time.
Like
every single podcast, new one comes up somehow. Yeah. So in a very real way, it's experiencing something. And I mean, I've heard numerous stories of guys who were just in bad situations, going back to this type of thing. Guys who were raised in gang families, or you think of Dr. Carson, Ben Carson. Right, he was raised in an area that was nothing but gangs, and his mom kind of just said, stick to the books, just keep going to the books. And as much as he didn't want to, it got him up and out of reality, or up and out of his current reality, because it forced him to say there's something beyond this. My little small shell that I see is not all of reality. So
Louis L'Amour was, Father James Shaw used to always recommend Louis L'Amour's autobiography. Yeah. It's The Education of a Wandering Man, I think. And, we always think of Mr. L'Amour as being a Western guy, which he was. But if you read about his life, man, that guy was a crazy adventurer from a young age all over the world. But the whole time he was reading the great classics, which you would never expect. But that informed his life. And I think that's why he was such a great writer. Even though he stuck to one genre, I think he was really good at what he did because he had this broad scope view of reality. So, before we close this interview, I think we need book recommendations. People are probably waiting for that. And so, if people are going to own some books, what are some books that you'd like to mention? I'm
going to have to plug Kristin Lavransdatter by Sigrid Undset, because nice. I think it's like my apostolate is to try to get as many people to read Kristin Lavransdatter as possible. So I think your wife bought Kristin Lavransdatter.
I was just thinking about that book. Yeah, she did.
So I've reread it maybe 4 times. It's kind of a wintry read, so it's a good time of year to read it because it takes place in Norway. It's very cold all the way through the book. But it was written in, I think, the 1930s or 40s by a Norwegian author. So it's in translation, but the Tina Nunnally translation, which came out in the late 90s, I think, is fabulous. So it's so good. And it's a long read. It's kind of an epic, so it follows one young woman until her death. Wow. And it's just full of the spiritual life and truths about marriage and children and family, and it's just the characters are so good and so they have so much depth that it's hard to believe they aren't real. Like they're just so good. And so if you want a long read, I would say go for that one. If you want a nonfiction spiritual read, I've been really into Carol Houselander's The Reed of God. It's a great book to read anytime during the liturgical year, but I think especially Advent or Lent. So it's about Our Lady, but it's really about how to be a Christian fully alive as Our Lady models for us. And it's just so insightful and best book I've ever read about Mary.
Really?
So I think those are maybe my 2. That's a short one. It's nonfiction, and then Kristen Lavren's daughter. It's a long one.
That's
it's
great.
Fiction.
Yeah. Well, I think, bringing up another mutual friend, Sarah Clarkson, has a book with a lot of great book
Yes, she
recommendations.
does. It's called Book Girl, and
Yeah.
it's fabulous.
Yeah, so-
And it's not just for girls.
Yeah, right,
My dad
exactly.
read it.
Yeah,
he loved
nice.
it.
Yeah, totally. Totally. Well, we're going to have you back for sure because we want to go a little. You started telling us your story about your family. You're going to make fun of me for saying story?
Story.
We have so many different accents in this office. We're always interrupting each other to make fun of each other. But you've begun to tell us your tale about your family uprooting and, to quote Wendell Berry and be geeky, to seek out the peace of wild things or something like that. I think he's got a great poem called that. It's an interesting story with twists and turns and something we want to talk to you more about. So next time we have you on, we'll go into that. And the book that you wrote that's, really based off of that experience called The Grace of Enough. So thanks for joining us today, and we're definitely going to have you back.
Awesome conversation.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for having me. This is fun.
You bet.
Yeah.
All right, so there's our interview with Haley Stewart, and a lot of great content there. One of the things I wish we would have talked about more, though, was about poetry, because I know that she's a big reader of poetry, but also Haley and Daniel in their home have introduced poetry to their children, and it's a big part of literature in their home in particular. And I think that's something that's maybe underrated by a lot of parents, is the value of reading poetry to your kids. And I know that's something that you do in your home.
Yeah, it is. It's kind of a practice we've been doing for a long time, partially just on a practical level because my kids do not sit still long enough to actually read a story. So like when she mentioned that they read the Silmarillion, even though I know it was like a very tiny baby, like my kids would never sit through that. It's just same thing as Lord of the Rings. Like we might get through a few paragraphs and they're just going to be too antsy to sit there. But poetry, and there's kind of like two aspects of it. One is there's like a humorous side to poetry that you can read. One of my kids' favorite ones is about how on a camping trip, Dad fell in the pond. And so they want to read that one constantly, But
You're not reading Eliot's Wasteland, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And there's some really good collections of classic poetry that's meant for kids. And so it's kind of on their level. But there's some of them that do kind of push beyond. There's some Kipling in there and some others. And of course, one thing I love doing is kind of like getting really into it. With an intense poem, you stand up in front of them and really make it a thing. But part of what my hope with reading poetry to my kids, number one, before the modern novel, it was poetry. That's what people operated on. That's how narratives were given. But number two, like it's a way in which, as something that really stood out to me that Haley had said, was the ability to kind of have a shared story and a shared experience. And so when it comes to poetry, if you do it right, you can really get your kids, interested in it. It's kind of a short thing, but there's also some humor to it, but it's also a great way to teach the memory because it's just, you can try to memorize 2 or 3 lines at a time. And so it's a way to kind of share a story in a different way.
Well, and there's probably bits and pieces of, say, Homer's Odyssey or Virgil or some of those old epic poems that are going to be exciting and interesting for even a young children's audience. And so, it's daunting to look at the size of those books, those poems, and to just kind of, leave those for way later in life when really we can begin to introduce even the great classics of poetry early on. A time will come probably fairly early as we begin to form kids in the faith to read something like Milton to our kids, for them to kind of ponder on the reality of evil and of the angels and in that case, Satan. There's, it sounds scary, but this is reality. And so a time comes, even sometimes for some kids, early in life, where these poems can really begin to introduce in a new way important theological truths as we form our kids. So poetry has a lot of power to not just entertain, but to form. Yeah.
And something that I love the way that Haley was talking about how, so many of the narratives that we can read to our kids. So right off the bat, I was thinking of like Kipling's Captain's Courageous.
Yeah.
And that whole story is about a young man who was kind of a spoiled brat becoming a man among men. And it shows his story. It shows kind of the inner process of it. It shows how men around him were treating him, some good and some bad. But in a way, for a young man to read that or a young boy to read that, it helps them kind of understand the process themselves. It helps them experience in a certain way And the same thing with our girls. But again, going back to what she said about like, as a family, we have this shared narrative. From that, you kind of get inside jokes. You get like inside aphorisms, stuff like that kind of creates a home culture. And so it's just a beautiful way to evangelize within the home, is to use literature. And it's, again, using Bishop Barron's, leading with beauty. It's a way to kind of enter into the imagination of the child that's also forming their rational capabilities. And so it's just a phenomenal way also to reach the modern culture, that whenever we're formed in these stories, whether it's poetry or narration or novel or whatever, it's a way that we can start to kind of have a lens by which we see the modern world. And this is something that Bishop Barron is just an expert at, is being able to watch a movie and understand, oh, that's a reference to this, to this, to this, to this, and it's leading up to now this story. So I just think it's such an important aspect of Inside the Home. But what do you think about people that maybe currently they don't read as a family? Maybe the adults in the house don't read. Like, what is some advice that we might be able to give to some of those folks that either trying to do it or they just struggle with it? What's a move there?
I would just say start reading. Like, what's your reason for not picking up a book and starting? I mean, start with something short. Get a book I'm reading right now is what's it called? It's by Thornton Wilder, and it's called The Bridge of Santa Del Rey or something like that. I can't remember the name now. But anyways, that was recommended by Dr. Chris Baglow to us. It was one of his favorite books. And in it, I don't think Wilder was necessarily, writing it from the perspective of a scientist or anything like that. But in the book, interestingly, it brings up the question of God's providence, the problem of evil, even the interplay between faith and reason. And I think Dr. Baglow said is like one of his favorite books. So I've been reading that. It's really short, but it's got a lot of interesting insights, and it's not a super hard read. So start with something short, that's been recommended by an authority you trust. And in fact, I would recommend going to something like John Senior's, I think it's called like his 1,000 Good Books. Have you heard of that list before? Yeah, and there's a lot. I mean, it's got everything from like a list included for like, it's like 5 to 7 year olds. Mortimer Adler has a list for that as well. That's based on grades in different ages. So there's numerous out there. So there's lots of good resources. But I would say like just start reading. And if you're finding that, sitting down and putting your eyes on the page and actually reading something, whether it's on a screen or on paper, is just not happening, try an audiobook. Lots of free ones on YouTube.
That's right. Yeah.
So
especially novels. Those are great to listen to on Audible and audiobooks. Another piece of advice that I might give is to figure out what you actually enjoy reading. Don't just pick up a book because somebody else lists it, although there's some great lists out there for a reason. But something that I had to come to find was, my introduction into kind of the bookish life was through literature. And so over time, I ended up falling in love more with philosophy, theology, deep thinking, et cetera, ideas. And so maybe you're more of an ideas guy, or maybe you're more of a literature guy. You like stories. And the way I initially started was putting a timer on myself of like, for the next 10 minutes, I'm focused. This is what I'm going to do. And if you're not reading and you add 10 minutes a day, that's an hour, or a little over an hour a week. So you can get through some stuff.
The crazy thing about today is the greatest books ever written are the cheapest they've ever been. So like in Canada, we have a store called Value Village. It's basically like secondhand stuff, and it's got everything from books to clothes. And it's one of my favorite places to buy books. You could take $100 into a store like that, or do a Salvation Army or something, and scan the shelves. There's usually a huge classics section. And you can literally walk out with like at least 50, if not close to 100 of the greatest books ever written for $100. And you immediately have this great collection of classics that will be in your family for as long as you keep them around. Then you can start books, and if it's not working for you, put it back on the shelf and find another one. So
and again, it's not necessarily like reading for reading's sake. It's reading to help form us as, of course, with this show, we're talking about being an evangelist. That the more you know, the more you can share, and the more you can kind of operate within the culture and understand it. Because whenever we're talking about, say, a lot of like the political movements of today or the way people think, it's like, well, let's point to Descartes or let's point to Hegel, and we can start to understand where a lot of this came from. Now that's pretty dense, deep stuff that you can get to, but there are other books to kind of help you along the way. But to get get back into our conversation with Haley, I think literature plays such an important and interesting role in the modern world, because people tend to that kind of polemic side, or the ability to, because like ideas you can now agree or disagree, whereas with literature it's like maybe you can agree or disagree on what a character did, but if it's a good story you can't really fight about that. Like it is what it is. It's just a good story.
Yeah, it's the incarnated truth that we kind of talk about, and I think we actually used that language in the interview, didn't we? Story just has that unique capacity, and so
Yeah. Well, another great episode. And again, for all of you who are not currently a member of the Word on Fire Institute, I would like to formally invite you to join us. So if you go to wordonfire.institute, there's numerous courses, specialized courses that we continue to unroll that involve theology, philosophy. We're right now we'll finish the John Henry Newman course from Bishop Barron before the end of this year. And of course, there's numerous other courses out there that you can enjoy. You also get access to Word on Fire Digital. You also, speaking of reading, you get this beautiful journal 4 times a year in the mail. And personally, I think that journal alone is well worth the cost of joining. So again, if you go to wordonfire.institute, you can join us in this movement to try to preach Christ to the culture. So another great interview, and everybody have a great day, and God bless.